That's a very urban outfit for first class, isn't it? With that one sentence, a gate agent didn't just deny a young black woman her flight. She lit a fuse. She had no idea this wasn't just any student she was bullying. She had no idea the young woman's phone contained a single number that could cripple an entire airline. What follows is not just a story of discrimination, it's a masterclass in consequence. A story of how one quiet phone call, made from the humiliation of a terminal flaw, triggered a financial earthquake that saw Aerowing Airlines' stock crash by 12% and vaporized over $1 billion in market value overnight. Stay with me to hear how it all went down. The air in Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport's Terminal D was a familiar symphony of chaos. The rolling clicks of suitcases, the cacophony of final boarding calls, and the low hum of thousands of intersecting journeys created a white noise that most travelers tuned out. For Imani Washington, it was the sound of opportunity. At 23, she was in her final year of law school, and the flight to New York was the last hurdle before her dream summer internship interview at one of the most prestigious corporate law firms in the world. She'd dressed for the part, a sophisticated forest green jumpsuit made of a heavy crepe fabric that looked like it was tailored for her. It was professional stylish and comfortable for the 3-hour flight. Paired with low, elegant heels and a leather satchel containing her meticulously prepared portfolio, she felt confident. Her first-class ticket, a proud gift from her parents for making it to the final interview round, was clutched in her hand. Gate D22 was an island of relative calm. The first-class boarding lane for Aerowing Airlines Flight 818 to LaGuardia was short. Imani took her place behind a man in a rumpled polo shirt and cargo shorts when he was waved through with a cheerful, "Enjoy your flight, sir." Imani stepped forward, a polite smile on her face. The gate agent, a woman in her late 40s with a severe blonde bob and a name tag that read Karen Miller, did not return the smile. Her eyes did a slow, deliberate crawl starting at Imani's shoes and climbing all the way to her neatly styled braids. The appraisal was cold, dismissive, and lasted just a second too long. "Ticket and ID, Karen," said, her voice flat. Imani handed them over. Karen barely glanced at the ID before her eyes fixed on the ticket. "First class," she muttered, as if the concept was perplexing. She looked back up at Imani, her lips tightening into a thin line. Then came the sentence that changed everything. "That's a very urban outfit for first class, isn't it?" The word hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Urban. It was a scalpel of a word, wielded with practiced precision to mean everything and nothing, a socially acceptable synonym for what she really wanted to say. Imani felt a hot flush of anger creep up her neck, but she kept her composure. She was a future lawyer. Facts, not feelings. "It's a jumpsuit," Imani stated calmly. "It meets all standard dress code requirements." Karen tapped a manicured finger on her computer screen, not looking at Imani. "Aerowing reserves the right to deny boarding to passengers whose attire is deemed inappropriate. It can be disruptive to the cabin environment." Imani glanced past Karen at the woman who had just boarded a white woman in her early 20s, wearing yoga pants, so thin they were nearly transparent, and a cropped tank top that exposed her entire midriff. She then looked at the man in the cargo shorts, who was now settling into his seat. "Her yoga pants and his cargo shorts are not disruptive, but my professional jumpsuit is." Imani's voice was steady, but an edge of steel had entered it. Karen's eyes narrowed. The quiet challenge to her authority had clearly rankled her. "Our staff is trained to interpret the dress code. Your outfit is form-fitting, and frankly, it looks like something you'd wear to a nightclub, not an airplane. We have standards to maintain." The insult was so flagrantly biased, so nakedly personal, that Imani was momentarily stunned. A nightclub. This meticulously chosen high-quality garment, I can assure you it's not, Imani said, her patience fraying. I am flying to New York for a final round interview with a major law firm. This is my professional attire. I would like to board my flight. That's not possible, Karen said with an air of finality. She pushed Imani's ticket and ID back across the counter. You can rebook on a later flight if you find something more suitable to wear. The public humiliation was a physical blow. The handful of people in the economy boarding line were now openly staring. Imani's mind raced. She could argue demand a supervisor make a scene. She looked at Karen's smug, unyielding face and knew it would be pointless. This wasn't about a dress code. This was about power and prejudice. Karen was enjoying this. I'd like to speak with your supervisor, Imani, said her voice, dropping to a low, serious register. A smirk played on Karen's lips. Of course. She spoke into her walkie-talkie. Greg, I need you at D22. I have a passenger who is failing to comply with our dress code policy. She framed it as if Imani were the one being difficult. A moment later, a harried-looking man named Greg arrived. He looked from Karen's resolute expression to Imani's calm, determined one. Karen quickly explained her version of the events, painting Imani as belligerent and her outfit as inappropriate and revealing. Imani countered, pointing out the other passengers who had been allowed to board. The policy is being applied in a discriminatory manner. I am being singled out. Greg looked uncomfortable. He was a man who clearly hated confrontation. He glanced at Imani's jumpsuit, then at Karen, then back. He saw a problem he wanted to disappear. The path of least resistance was to back his employee. Ma'am, our agents have the final say on these matters. Karen was just doing her job, he said weakly. The dress code is in the terms and conditions. I'm sorry, but we can't let you board dressed like that. The finality of it was like a door slamming shut. The jet bridge was about to be pulled back. The flight, her interview, her meticulously planned future was slipping away because of the arbitrary whim of a woman who didn't like the way she looked. So to be clear, Imani said, her voice now dangerously quiet, you are denying me, a ticketed first-class passenger, boarding based on a subjective and discriminatory application of a vague dress code, while allowing other passengers in far more casual and revealing attire to board. Greg just wrung his hands. I'm sorry. There's nothing I can do, I see, Imani said. She gave Karen one last, long look. It was a look that held no overt anger, but a deep, chilling promise of consequence. Then she stepped back from the counter, took out her phone, and found a quiet spot against the terminal wall as Flight 8018 began to push back from the gate without her. She didn't call her parents. She didn't call the airline's customer service hotline. She scrolled to a single name in her contacts, Uncle Reggie. She pressed the call button. He picked up on the first ring. Imani, you should be in the air. Everything okay? His warm, baritone voice asked. Not exactly, Uncle Reggie, she said, the adrenaline beginning to subside, replaced by a cold resolve. I've just had a very interesting experience with Aerowing Airlines. I think you'll want to hear about it. Reginald Reggie Washington was not the kind of man you trifled with. To the public, he was a titan of finance, the founder of the activist investment fund Washington Capital. Forbes called him the conscience of Wall Street, a moniker he earned by taking massive positions in publicly traded companies and forcing their boards to reckon with ethical, social, and governance failures. He didn't just look at profit margins. He looked at patterns of discrimination, environmental negligence, and corporate rot. And when he found it, he didn't just divest. He exposed. To Imani, he was simply Uncle Reggie, the man who'd taught her how to play chess and quizzed her on tort law at family dinners. He was fiercely protective, brilliant, and possessed a sense of justice as sharp as a diamond. When Imani called, he was in his home office, a sleek glass-walled space overlooking Central Park. He listened silent and focused as she recounted the entire incident. He didn't interrupt. He let her speak, hearing not just the facts, but the calculated humiliation in her voice. He heard the name Karen Miller, the supervisor, Greg the flimsy excuse the word urban. When she finished, there was a brief pause. It wasn't a pause of indecision. It was the silence of a predator marking its prey. Imani first, are you safe? And is there anything you need right now? His voice was calm, but layered with a cold fury that would have terrified anyone who knew his reputation. I'm fine, Uncle Reggie. I'm sitting in the Admiral's Club. I used my backup pass. I'll book a flight on another airline. No, don't. Stay there. I want you to write down every single detail. Every word you can remember, the names, the time, the flight number, the appearance of the other passengers. Be the lawyer I know you are. Be meticulous. Okay, she said. Second, I want you to understand that what happened to you was not a random act of poor customer service. He continued, his voice hardening. It was a symptom of a diseased corporate culture. And I happen to know quite a bit about the disease at Aero Wing. Imani was confused. What do you mean Aero Wing has been on my radar for months? I've been quietly accumulating data. They have a statistically significant pattern of bumping non-white passengers off overbooked flights. Their subcontractor for baggage handling is facing a class action lawsuit for racial discrimination. Their board is a homogeneous boys' club. They are rotten, Imani. But their stock is high, and their PR is slick. They are a bloated whale basking in the sun, waiting for a harpoon. That gate agent, Karen Miller, just handed it to me. A shiver went down Imani's spine. She was no longer just a wronged passenger. She was the catalyst. What are you going to do? She asked. The market opens in an hour, Reggie said. First, my fund, Washington Capital, will be filing a 13F amendment to disclose our position in Aero Wing. It's not a huge stake, only about $45 million. It's our canary in the coal mine investment. We will be liquidating the entire position at market open. The sale itself is a drop in the bucket, but the signal it sends will be a sonic boom. Imani, a student of corporate law, understood immediately. Washington Capital pulling out of a company was a major red flag to the entire investment community. Then Reggie continued at precisely 9:35 a.m. Eastern Time. My publicist will be releasing a statement to the press. Concurrently, a post will go live on my widely read financial blog. The title is Rot at 30,000 Feet, the Systemic Racism Propping Up Aero Wing Airlines. It will lead with the story of a brilliant young black law student being denied boarding on her way to a life-changing interview. Your story, Imani. It will then connect that specific human incident to the mountain of data we've collected. It will lay bare their hypocrisy from their performative diversity ads to the ugly reality in their terminals. He paused. They wanted to talk about your disruptive attire. Fine. Let's talk about a disruption. I am going to short their stock. I'm going to bet heavily against them. I'm going to make every institutional investor who holds their shares question whether they want to be associated with this brand of bigotry. Karen Miller wanted to judge your appearance. I am about to judge their entire enterprise. She cost you a $300 plane ticket. I am going to cost her CEO his job. Imani was speechless. The scale of the response was breathtaking. It was a corporate blitzkrieg. Uncle Reggie, That's proportional, he finished for her. This is how you fight them, Imani. Not by yelling at a gate agent. You don't fight a dragon by swatting at its claws. You go for the heart. And a publicly traded company's heart is its stock price. Now get to writing. Send me your notes. I have some calls to make. The line went dead. Imani sat in the sterile quiet of the airline lounge, the half-eaten complimentary muffin forgotten on its plate. The humiliation and anger she'd felt were being rapidly replaced by something else, a sense of awe. She had been a pawn in one woman's petty game of power. Now she was the face of a billion-dollar crusade. She opened a new note on her laptop and began to type, her fingers flying across the keys. She remembered every word. At 9:30 a.m. in the Aerowing Airlines corporate headquarters in Fort Worth, CEO Robert Sterling was enjoying his second coffee of the day. On the massive screen on his wall, AWG, their stock ticker was trading at a healthy $52.15 a share. They had just released a glowing quarterly earnings report. The future looked bright. At 9:31 a.m., a tremor went through the market. A massive sell order for nearly 1 million shares of AWG hit the floor. It was Washington Capital's entire position. The price dipped slightly to $51.90. Sterling's chief financial officer, a perpetually anxious man named Michael, called him. "Bob, did you see that Washington just dumped us?" Sterling wasn't concerned. "Relax, Michael. Reggie Washington is a showman. He probably needed the liquidity for one of his crusades. It's a blip. The market will absorb it." He was wrong. It wasn't a blip. It was the warning shot. At exactly 9:35 a.m., the world exploded. Every major financial news network, Bloomberg, CNBC, Reuters, flashed the same breaking headline: activist investor Reginald Washington accuses Aerowing of systemic racism, short stock. Simultaneously, phones on the corporate communications floor began ringing off the hook. An alert popped up on Sterling's computer, a link to Washington's blog post. He clicked it. The title "Rot at 30,000 feet" made his stomach clench. He read the opening paragraph, his face draining of color. It described in vivid and damning detail the incident at Gate D22. It named the flight, the destination, and the victim Imani Washington, a promising law student, and crucially Reginald Washington's niece. The personal connection turned the story from a corporate critique into a declaration of war. The Post then pivoted, weaving Imani's story into a devastating tapestry of corporate malfeasance. It cited internal statistics, leaked documents, and patterns of behavior that painted Aerowing not as a hapless victim of one rogue employee, but as a culture that fostered and protected such behavior. On the screen on his wall, Sterling watched in horror as AWG went into freefall. The stock ticker turned into a waterfall of red. $50, $48.50, $47. Panic selling began. Automated trading algorithms programmed to react to negative news and keywords like investigation, racism, and lawsuit began dumping millions of shares. Institutional investors, terrified of being linked to the scandal, started liquidating their positions. "Get PR in here now," Sterling roared into his intercom. The PR team, led by a slick executive named Patricia, rushed in, their faces pale. "We need a statement," Sterling demanded. "Say it's an isolated incident. We're investigating. We take these allegations seriously. Standard procedure, Robert." "It's not that simple," Patricia said, holding up her tablet. "The story is already the #1 trend on Twitter. Flying while black and Aerowing attire are exploding. People are sharing their own horror stories with our airline. This isn't a spark. It's a wildfire." The stock hit $46. They had just lost over $1 billion in market capitalization in less than 15 minutes. Sterling's phone buzzed. It was the chairman of the board. He answered it with a trembling hand. "Robert, what in God's name is going on?" the chairman barked. "My phone hasn't stopped ringing. Reginald Washington is on CNBC right now, tearing us to shreds. He's calling for your resignation." Sterling switched the channel on his big screen. There was Reggie, cool and composed in a crisp suit, speaking with an anchor. "This isn't about one dress or one employee," Reggie was saying. "This is about a corporate culture that sees a young, successful black woman and views her as a threat. Their gate agent didn't see a first-class passenger. She saw someone who didn't belong in her narrow, prejudiced worldview." Aerowings leadership has fostered this environment through neglect and cronyism. This rot starts at the top. The board needs to ask Mr. Sterling why this was allowed to happen under his watch. Back in the DFW Admirals Club, Imani watched the same broadcast on her laptop, a crowd of travelers gathering around the lounge's television. Her phone was buzzing incessantly with texts from friends and classmates who had seen the news. Her face wasn't shown, her privacy protected by her uncle, but her story was everywhere. The official statement from Aerowing came out an hour later. It was a textbook example of corporate cowardice. It spoke of a misunderstanding regarding our dress code policy and promised a full internal review. It didn't apologize. It didn't name Imani. It didn't acknowledge the accusation of racism. The market reacted with disgust. The stock, which had briefly stabilized, took another nosedive, $45.80, $45.50, a full 12% drop from the morning's open. Over $1.5 billion in value gone, wiped out by one gate agent's prejudice and one man's perfectly executed revenge. In his office, Robert Sterling felt the walls closing in. This wasn't a PR problem anymore. This was an existential threat. The board was in full-blown panic. They demanded an immediate, independent investigation. They wanted answers. They wanted a head on a platter. And they all knew where the investigation had to start at Gate D22, with a gate agent named Karen Miller and her supervisor Greg. Their small, miserable act of power was about to be placed under a microscope, and the entire world would be watching. The command to launch an independent investigation came directly from Aerowing's terrified board of directors. They bypassed Robert Sterling and hired a top-tier crisis management firm, which immediately dispatched a team of ruthless corporate investigators to DFW. Their mandate was simple: find the truth, identify the liability, and cauterize the wound before it killed the company. The first two people on their list were Karen Miller and Greg. Karen arrived for her interview, feeling strangely defiant. In her mind, she was the victim. She had been doing her job enforcing a policy and had been targeted by a wealthy, powerful man who was using his influence to destroy her life. She'd spent the last 24 hours reading supportive comments in fringe online forums that validated her worldview, calling her a hero for standing up to the woke mob. She walked into the conference room with an air of righteous indignation. The lead investigator, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Maria, didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Ms. Miller, please walk us through the events of yesterday morning at Gate D22. Karen recounted her version, peppering it with defensive jargon. She described Imani's jumpsuit as provocative and unprofessional. She claimed Imani had become immediately hostile. She insisted she was simply upholding the family-friendly environment that Aerowing promoted. "You cited the dress code," Maria said, sliding a copy of the Aerowing employee manual across the table. "Can you please point to the specific rule that a professional jumpsuit violates?" Karen fumbled through the pages. The code was intentionally vague, mentioning prohibitions on attire that was lewd, obscene, or patently offensive. There was nothing about jumpsuits. There was, however, a picture in the examples section showing a person in ripped, frayed jeans with a large red X over it. "It falls under general inappropriateness," Karen insisted. "It's a judgment call." "A judgment call," Maria repeated, her voice flat. "Let's talk about your judgment. We've pulled the boarding logs and CCTV footage. At 8:45 a.m., a woman in a cropped top and yoga pants boarded. At 8:47 a.m., a man in cargo shorts and a faded t-shirt boarded. At 8:50 a.m., Ms. Washington approached. You singled her out. Can you explain why her tailored jumpsuit was more inappropriate than their attire? It was form-fitting. It was aggressive, Karen stammered, realizing how weak it sounded. So a black woman in a fitted outfit is aggressive. But a white woman in see-through leggings is not. Maria asked, her brow arched. The accusation hung in the air. Karen's face flushed. I am not a racist. This has nothing to do with race. Then let's look at your record, Maria said, pulling out a new file. This is your employee file. Over the last 2 years, you have flagged passengers for secondary security screening at a rate 400% higher than the terminal average, and 85% of those you flagged were people of color. You've filed dress code violation reports on 12 passengers. All 12 were black or Hispanic. In contrast, you have never once reported a white passenger. How do you explain this pattern? Karen's defiance crumbled. The numbers were stark, irrefutable. Her personal biases, which she'd always considered simple, good judgment, were laid bare as a clear, undeniable pattern of discrimination. She had no answer. Maria wasn't finished. We also recovered your internal emails. 3 months ago, you sent an email to your supervisor, Greg, complaining about the element that frequent flyer miles were bringing into the first-class cabin. You wrote, and I quote, "It used to be a place for professionals, now it looks like a rap video." Can you elaborate on what you meant by that? Karen stared at her own words on the page printed in black and white. There was no escape. Next was Greg. He entered the room, already defeated. He had seen the news. He knew this was serious. Unlike Karen, he had no illusions of being a hero. He was a middle manager who had made a catastrophic mistake. He tried to defend his actions, claiming he was supporting his employee. But under Maria's relentless questioning, his story fell apart. "Did you witness the interaction?" Greg Maria asked. From the side, he mumbled. "Did you hear Ms. Miller's comment about the passenger's outfit being urban?" Greg hesitated. He looked down at his hands. "I might have. I'm not sure. The CCTV audio is quite clear." Greg Maria lied, a classic interrogation tactic. "We can hear you standing right there." "Let me ask again, did you hear her use that word?" Panic flashed in Greg's eyes. He nodded, a tiny, miserable movement. "Yes." "And as a supervisor, when you hear an employee use racially coded and inflammatory language toward a customer, what is the correct procedure? I should have de-escalated." Pulled her aside. "But you didn't," Maria stated. "Instead, you backed her play. You allowed a paying customer to be humiliated and denied boarding based on what you knew was a prejudiced judgment." Why, Greg finally broke. "Look, Karen is difficult." It was easier to just agree with her. I didn't want the confrontation. I just wanted the problem to go away. I thought the passenger would just leave rebook and that would be the end of it. It was a pathetic, cowardly confession, and it was exactly what Maria needed. He hadn't acted out of malice, but out of a spinelessness that enabled malice. In the corporate world, that was just as damning. The investigator's report landed on the board's desk that evening. It was a brutal document. It concluded that the incident was not a misunderstanding, but a clear case of racial discrimination perpetrated by Karen Miller and enabled by the gross negligence of her supervisor, Greg. It further identified a systemic pattern of bias in Miller's work history that had gone unchecked by management. The consequences were swift and severe. Karen Miller was terminated immediately for cause for violating company policy discrimination and creating a hostile environment. Her dream of retiring with a full pension evaporated. Greg was also fired for gross negligence failure to perform his supervisory duties and complicity in a discriminatory act. But the board knew that firing 2 mid-level employees was not enough. The firestorm was raging around their CEO and the company's culture. The bleeding hadn't stopped. Reginald Washington had made it clear that this wasn't about 2 employees. It was about the entire system, and the system had a head, Robert Sterling. The firings of Karen, Miller, and Greg were a token sacrifice, and everyone knew it. They were the limbs offered to the beast, but the beast, a furious public, and an equally furious market, was still hungry. Aerowings stock had stopped its freefall, but now hovered in a nauseating limbo bleeding value, slowly like a patient dying from 1,000 cuts. The board of directors, a collection of the most powerful men and women in Texas industry, had convened an emergency meeting that was less a discussion and more a ritualistic flaying of their CEO. Robert Sterling stood before them, the slick confidence he usually wore stripped away, leaving a man pale with fear. The chairman of the board, a formidable oil baron named Harrison Croft, did not mince words. "Robert, you have presided over the single greatest self-inflicted disaster in this company's history." Croft's voice was a low growl that filled the boardroom. "You allowed our brand to become a global synonym for bigotry. You let a 2-bit gate agent with a grudge vaporize over $1 billion of shareholder value. This is not a PR crisis. This is a cancer, and you are the attending physician who let it metastasize." Sterling began to speak, to offer excuses about rogue employees and unforeseen circumstances, but Croft cut him off with a slice of his hand. "Save it. Reginald Washington's office has responded to our request for a meeting. He will not be attending. He is sending his niece, the young woman we so grievously wronged, in his stead. She has agreed to meet with you in 2 days at the offices of her new legal counsel." Croft let that sink in. "Robert, I want you to understand this. You will go to that meeting. You will crawl on broken glass if you have to. You will give that young woman and her uncle whatever they want. This is not a negotiation. It is an act of unconditional surrender. You will fix what you broke, or by Friday you will be a cautionary tale I tell at cocktail parties. Is that clear?" Crystal Sterling whispered the single word, tasting like ash in his mouth. 2 days later, Imani Washington sat in a conference room that felt more like a command center. The meeting was being held on the 50th floor of the skyscraper housing Cromwell Sterling and Associates, the firm that had not only offered her the internship, but had fast-tracked her into their corporate litigation department. She was flanked by 2 of the firm's most feared senior partners, a man and a woman whose combined billable hours could finance a small nation. Across the table, her Uncle Reggie was patched in via a large, secure video link, his presence as palpable as if he were in the room. They weren't just waiting, they were strategizing. They were wargaming every possible move Sterling could make. He'll open with a groveling apology one of the partners, Mr. Davies, predicted. Then he'll pivot to a significant 7-figure monetary offer. He'll call it a settlement, but it's a gag order. He wants you to take the money and disappear. He thinks my silence is for sale. Imani said, a cold fire in her eyes. He thinks this is about me. And that is his fatal mistake. Reggie's voice boomed from the screen. He sees a victim seeking compensation. He doesn't see a visionary seeking reformation. Don't let him control the narrative for a second, Imani. This is your room, your terms. When Robert Sterling and his 2 corporate lawyers were shown into the room, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Sterling looked even worse than he had in the boardroom. His suit seemed to hang off him, and his eyes were hollow. He carried a leather-bound folder like a shield. He began immediately, his voice strained and rehearsed. Ms. Washington, I want to begin by offering my deepest, most profound and unreserved apology on behalf of every single employee at Aerowing Airlines for the abhorrent treatment you received. Imani let the words hang in the air, allowing the silence to stretch into an uncomfortable eternity. Then she leaned forward, her hands clasped on the polished table. Mr. Sterling, she began, her voice calm and dangerously precise. Let's start there. You apologized for the treatment I received. That's a passive construction. It's the kind of language used to describe bad weather, not a deliberate act of racial discrimination perpetrated by your employee, an act that was then ratified by her negligent supervisor, both of whom were operating within a corporate culture that you as CEO have cultivated. Let's use precise language, shall we? I am, after all, a lawyer now, thanks in part to your company's actions. Sterling flinched as if he'd been struck. His lawyers shifted uneasily. He opened his folder, clearly trying to get back to his script. Of course, the actions were inexcusable. And while no amount of money can undo the distress, we are prepared to offer you a personal settlement, a gesture to acknowledge the harm done. We believe a sum of $2 million would be— Imani held up a hand, and he stopped mid-sentence. Mr. Sterling, do you truly believe my dignity has a price tag? She asked, her voice dripping with contempt. Do you think you can write a check and the systemic rot that led a woman to look at me and see a threat instead of a customer will magically disappear? You fundamentally misunderstand why we are here. I am not here to get rich. I am here to get justice, and justice for the community your company has harmed is not for sale. She pushed the folder he had opened back toward him. Close that. You are not here to offer. You are here to listen. You are here to accept the terms of your company's continued existence. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. She then took out a single sheet of paper. My uncle and I, along with my counsel, have drafted a list of demands. They are comprehensive, they are non-negotiable, and they are the only path forward for Aerowing. You will agree to every point here and now, or I will walk out of this room. My uncle will resume his short position, and Mr. Croft will have your resignation before sunset. She looked Sterling dead in the eye and began articulating each point with the clarity of a surgeon. 1. The Aerowing Promise Scholarship. You will establish a $50 million, independently administered, endowed scholarship fund. Its mission will be to fund the education of women and students of color, pursuing careers in every facet of aviation. Your company blocked one door for me. You will now spend the rest of your corporate life opening 10,000 doors for others who look like me. 2. A complete training overhaul. Your current diversity programs are a legal shield designed to protect you from liability, not a tool for genuine change. They have failed. You will terminate those contracts immediately. A new curriculum will be designed from the ground up by a panel of DEI and sociological experts. I will chair the committee that selects them and approves their work. Your employees will no longer be taught to avoid lawsuits. They will be taught to dismantle their own biases. Sterling's jaw was tight. He looked at his lawyers, who gave him a barely perceptible shake of the head, a signal that there was no room to fight. 3. The public confession. Imani continued, her voice relentless. The wound you inflicted was public, so the apology must be public. You personally will hold a live televised press conference. You will not hide behind corporate statements. You will look into the camera and you will tell the world that what happened was not a misunderstanding, but an act of racism fostered by systemic bias within Aerowing. You will use that specific word, racism. Refusing to name the disease is a symptom of it. You will then detail every demand on this list and frame it not as a settlement, but as a long overdue penance. And finally, she said, her voice dropping slightly, permanent community oversight. Accountability cannot be a temporary response to a crisis. It must be permanent. You will create a new permanent seat on the Aerowing Board of Directors. This seat will be filled by a president or senior executive from a leading national civil rights organization approved by my uncle. This director will have full voting powers and will chair a new fully funded board committee on corporate ethics and accountability. Your company will no longer be allowed to police itself. The community will now have a permanent voice in the room where the real decisions are made. She finished and placed the paper on the table. The silence in the room was absolute. Robert Sterling stared at the list, seeing not words, but the complete and total surrender of his authority. It was a public flagellation, a transfer of power, and a fundamental reshaping of his company from the outside in. It was humiliating, it was audacious, and he knew with a soul-crushing certainty that it was the only choice he had. He looked at Imani Washington, at the young woman his company had tried to break, and saw in her eyes not youthful idealism, but the cold, hard brilliance of a master strategist. He saw Reginald Washington's protégé. He saw the future. He took a slow breath, the air of the vanquished. "We agree," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. Aerowing agrees to all of it. After Sterling and his team shuffled out of the room, looking like ghosts, Imani's lawyers both broke into wide smiles. "Ms. Washington," Mr. Davies said, shaking his head in admiration. "In 30 years of practice, that was the most elegant and complete decapitation of a corporate opponent I have ever witnessed." Imani gave a small, weary smile and looked at the screen where her uncle's face was beaming with pride. "You did it, kiddo," Reggie said, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't just demand an apology. You demanded a new world and gave him the blueprints." Imani leaned back in her chair, the adrenaline finally beginning to subside. The fight wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But it was now a fight on her terms. She hadn't just gotten justice. She had seized the power to define what justice would look like for years to come. 1 year later, the storm had passed, but the climate had permanently changed. Aerowing Airlines was a company reborn, or at least in the throes of a painful and public rebirth. The stock had recovered, settling at a valuation slightly below its peak, but with a stability that reassured investors. The name Robert Sterling was no longer a synonym for corporate failure, but for a near miraculous turnaround. Yet beneath the polished surface of the new PR campaigns and glowing financial reports, the real work, the grinding, messy human work of dismantling a toxic culture, was happening one difficult meeting at a time. Imani Washington, now an associate at one of New York's top law firms, sat at the head of a sterile glass conference table in Aerowing's Fort Worth headquarters. The title on the door read, "Quarterly Review Community and Employee Training Initiative." But everyone in the room knew it was her unofficial throne room. The terms of the settlement had given her committee, and by extension, her unprecedented power over the company's internal life. Across from her sat Richard Davenport, the executive VP of operations. He was a holdover from the old guard, a man with jet fuel in his veins, who had started as a baggage handler 30 years ago, and viewed the airline in purely mechanical terms: on-time departures, fuel costs, and passenger load. To him, this entire initiative was an expensive, inefficient distraction. "With all due respect, Miss Washington," Richard began his tone, making it clear he had none. "We're seeing a 12% increase in turnaround time at gates where the new conscious engagement protocol is being tested. We're holding planes for sensitivity training. My people are being forced to role-play scenarios instead of learning how to de-ice a wing in record time. This is affecting our bottom line." Imani met his gaze without blinking. She had anticipated this pushback. For the first few months, the old guard had been too scared to move. Now, with the stock stable, they were testing the fences. Your bottom line took a $1.5 billion hit because one of your people couldn't tell the difference between a professional and a prejudice. Richard Imani said, her voice cutting through the room's tension. The protocols are designed to prevent that from ever happening again. The delay, as you call it, is the time it takes for an employee to assess a situation with thoughtful consideration instead of a knee-jerk bias. We are not selling widgets. We are providing a service to human beings. She slid a tablet across the table. And since you're concerned with the bottom line, let's look at some other numbers. Formal customer complaints related to discrimination are down 92% year over year. Employee-filed harassment claims are down 70%. Our brand sentiment among travelers aged 18 to 35, a key growth demographic, has seen a net positive swing of 40 points. This isn't just about feeling good, it's about good business. Your definition of efficiency was bankrupting the company's reputation. Richard's face reddened. He had come prepared for a fight with a young idealist. He found himself facing a seasoned lawyer armed with data. "This is still an overreach," he muttered, gesturing to a budget proposal. $1 million for a cultural empathy consultant. We could buy a new set of ground power units for that. "You have the new units," Imani countered smoothly. "The board approved them last quarter at the recommendation of Dr. Vance. The consultant, who is the foremost expert in her field, is non-negotiable. Her contract is mandated by the settlement you all signed. Are you suggesting we violate the terms of that agreement? Richard Y. can have our legal team draft a letter to the board, reminding them of the potential consequences, if you'd like." It was a perfectly executed checkmate. The threat of reigniting the legal and public relations nightmare that nearly destroyed them was the ultimate trump card. Richard Davenport slumped back in his chair, defeated. The message was sent not just to him, but to everyone in the room who thought the changes were merely temporary. Imani Washington was not just a symbol. She was an architect, and she was building something on the ashes of their old world, whether they liked it or not. The true impact of her architecture could be seen far from the corporate boardroom. In a training center near Chicago's O'Hare Airport, a group of new Aero Wing flight attendants were in the middle of a scenario. The room was set up like the interior of a plane. One of the trainees, a young man, was playing the role of a flight attendant, while an actor portraying a passenger was belligerently refusing to put his bag in the overhead bin, making thinly veiled xenophobic comments about another passenger, also an actor. Observing from the back of the room was Robert Sterling and Dr. Alana Vance. Dr. Vance was the civil rights leader who had taken the new seat on Aero Wing's board. She was a calm, formidable woman in her 60s with a reputation for suffering no fools. In the old days, the training would have focused solely on the security protocol, how to subdue or report the passenger. The new curriculum, the one Imani's committee had designed, was different. The trainee didn't just spout regulations. He first calmly de-escalated the belligerent passenger, then turned his attention to the passenger being targeted by the abuse. "Sir," he said to the targeted man, "I want to apologize for the behavior you are being subjected to. It is not acceptable on this or any Aero Wing flight. Please let me know if there is anything I can do to make you feel more comfortable. I can move you to another seat if you prefer." Dr. Vance nodded slowly, a hint of a smile on her face. "That's it, Robert," she said quietly to the CEO. "That's the difference. You're not just training them to be security guards. You're training them to be guardians of a safe environment. You're giving them the language to actively stand for something, not just against something. Sterling, a man profoundly changed by his public humiliation and the year of intensive work that followed, watched with genuine pride. A year ago, he confessed, "I would have called this a waste of time. I would have sided with Richard Davenport. I only saw the plane, the schedule, the profit. I never saw the people inside it. The change wasn't just in the air, it was on the ground." Miles away in a flight simulator in Arizona, a young woman named Sofia Ramirez was executing a perfect landing. A wide grin spread across her face as the instructor gave her a thumbs up. Sofia was one of the inaugural recipients of the Aero Wing Promise Scholarship. A year ago, she was working 2 jobs to pay for community college, her dream of being a pilot seemingly impossible. Today, she was months away from earning her commercial license. Her picture was on the cover of the scholarship's first annual report, a potent symbol of the company's new direction. The $50 million fund wasn't just PR, it was actively changing the face of the aviation industry, one deserving student at a time. Meanwhile, in a sprawling, fluorescent-lit superstore in a drab suburb outside Houston, Karen Miller was living in the echo. Her name, once printed on a crisp Aero Wing name badge, was now scrawled in marker on a sticker stuck to a red vest. She worked the 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift stocking shelves in the pet food aisle. The work was anonymous, mindless, and paid just enough to cover the rent on her small, bleak apartment. Her infamy was a permanent ghost. She had cut and dyed her severe blonde hair to a mousy brown, wore glasses, and had lost weight from the stress. But in the age of the internet, her face was forever memorialized. Viral clips of her smug expression at the gate, juxtaposed with news reports of the stock crash, still circulated in instant justice compilations. One night, a younger co-worker, a college kid stocking energy drinks across the aisle, paused and stared at her. "Hey," he said, pulling out his phone. "This is going to sound weird, but are you—" The Aero Wing lady, Karen's blood ran cold. She felt the same hot flush of shame she'd once inflicted on Imani. "I don't know what you're talking about," she mumbled, turning away her hands, trembling as she tried to arrange bags of dog food. "No, dude, it's totally you," the kid said, not with malice, but with a kind of detached awe. He held up his phone, showing a screenshot from a YouTube video. "My sister is a law student, and she loves this story. She says Imani Washington is like her hero. It's crazy seeing you in real life. The casual mention of Imani's name as a hero was a shard of glass in her gut. Shikoran was not a person. She was a stepping stone in someone else's heroic journey, a villain in a story that was not her own. She dropped a bag of kibble, and it split open on the floor. She fled to the break room, her heart hammering in her chest, leaving the kid to stare at the mess. Her final attempt at reclaiming her narrative had fizzled out months ago. She'd contacted a far-right podcast, The Patriot's Pulpit, pitching herself as a victim of cancel culture. The host, a man who peddled outrage for a living, had her on the phone for 5 minutes before cutting her off. "Listen, lady," he'd said, his voice bored. "The Aero Wing thing is ancient history. We need fresh meat. You got fired, you lost a lawsuit. It's a bummer. What's the angle now?" "There's no angle. You're just a lady who lost her job. Call me back if the woke mob tries to take away your dog or something." He'd hung up. Her irrelevance was the cruelest cut of all. She wasn't a martyr. She wasn't a cultural warrior. She was just old news, a forgotten footnote. Her power, once absolute over a 10-foot stretch of airport carpet, was gone. All that was left was the lingering, bitter shame and the smell of processed dog food. Months later, in a quiet corner of a bustling New York restaurant, Imani sat across from her Uncle Reggie. The city lights twinkled behind him. The frantic energy of the past year had settled into a steady, purposeful rhythm. Richard Davenport is filing a grievance with the union over the new performance metrics, Imani said, swirling the wine in her glass. He's claiming they are unfairly biased against long-term employees who weren't hired under the new psychological profiling standards. Reggie smiled, taking a bite of his steak. Of course he is. The antibodies of the old system will always try to attack the transplant. What are you going to do? What I was trained to do, Imani said, a confident smile playing on her lips. I'm going to drown him in legal precedent and data until he stops. The metrics are sound. The system is working. It's just slow. Real change always is, Reggie said, his voice warm with pride. He looked at his niece, no longer the shaken student on the phone from the airport, but a formidable force of nature. She hadn't just won a battle. She had taken charge of the peace. She was a builder. I was so angry that day, Imani reflected, looking out at the city. All I wanted was for that one woman to feel a fraction of the humiliation I felt. And she has, Reggie said. But you've done so much more. Don't ever forget that, Imani. You didn't just get justice for yourself. You built a justice factory for thousands of other people. You turned a moment of ugly prejudice into a legacy of opportunity. Some people tear things down. You are building something that will last. Imani looked at her hands, the hands that had been denied passage, that had dialed the fateful call that now signed off on policy changes affecting thousands. The fight was far from over. There would always be another Richard Davenport, another challenge, another corner of the culture that resisted the light. But for the first time, she truly understood the difference. The echo of that one racist sentence was fading, replaced by the rising symphony of the new world she was architecting. And it was a beautiful sound. And that's how a single act of prejudice at an airport gate led to a corporate giant being brought to its knees. It's a powerful reminder that in our interconnected world, there are no small actions. The choices we make, the biases we hold, can have consequences that ripple out in ways we can never predict. Imani's story isn't just about revenge, it's about accountability. It shows that when you challenge injustice with intelligent strategy and leverage, you can force change on a massive scale. What Karen Miller intended as an act of humiliation became her own undoing and the catalyst for a corporate revolution. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button to help it reach more people. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next deep dive. What are your thoughts on this? Let me know in the comments below.